Imke. I've just almost finished my PhD, so I'm done with the most part. Done the final seminar, it's still under review, so I don't want to jinx it. But today I'd like to talk to you about some of the findings from that work that I've done throughout the last 3.5 years. And the topic that I've chosen to look at was behavioural economics and decision-making in personal insolvency. The first thing you might ask yourself is, well, why personal insolvency, and what does behavioural economics even have to do with it? The very short answer is decisions in personal insolvency are very complex. They're important, with significant and long-term effects on not only the debtors themselves, but creditors, the society around them. And at the same time, we don't actually know much about how those decisions are made and what the decision environment looks like that people make them in. Now, I'll break that down for you a little bit. So if you have to make a choice between an available debt resolution option because you are in financial distress, you have to make a decision as to how you want to resolve that. You're making that decision while you're under financial distress, so you have other things like where do I live, how do I pay rent, all these type of things to think about. A lot of people have or experience mental distress from that scenario in itself. Then there's impacts from the regulatory framework and the institutions. So for example, things like if you choose a bankruptcy or a debt agreement to resolve your options, there will be a public record of you entering such options. And you know, what may that do? You also have to deal with public perceptions of the options that you choose and the stigma that may be attached to it. That may lead to discrimination. There's a couple of other studies around that have actually found that the discrimination is quite significant. If you're then overwhelmed with all of this, you might consider looking for information or looking for expert advice. But that has its own problems because you have to choose an advisor to ask. So where do you go? Public information is somewhat available, but it may be of varying quality, so you have to identify what that does to you. So the decision is quite complex. Consequences are harsh, and that's the important bit, because the complexity in itself wouldn't matter if the consequence of it would be short-lived or very mild. But if consequences are very harsh, then you want to make a good decision and a considered decision in this complex environment. And previous research has showed that because you can't normally reverse the decision that you've made, once you've decided going into one debt resolution process, you kind of have to stick with it. Choosing the wrong one can actually prolong and exacerbate the hardship that you're already experiencing. Then there's the stigma and discrimination that comes from the choice that you've made. If you've chosen wrong, and there's fees involved from experts, from choosing the option themselves, the regulator will charge a fee as well. You lower your actual repayment to creditors, which may prolong the entire process. Just being overwhelmed by the situation itself. Some people take longer to make a decision. In the literature, they call that the sweat box. So people stay there a little bit longer because they're overwhelmed and they don't really know what to do. And then there's inefficient incentives in the market for advice where, and I'll go into this a little bit further later, where some types of advisors in some circumstances can gain a financial benefit from advertising or promoting one option over another one. At the same time, we don't actually know much about how those decisions are made and what the choice environment looks like. There's a scarcity of empirical research specifically, which is a problem because it makes informed and evidence-based policy making different, which could actually then help resolve or reduce some of those impacts. And there's several reasons why we don't have enough empirical research. For one, there's only very limited administrative data that's available. One reason for that, the regulator that collected, for the most part, only collected a kind of one point in time, which is when you apply for an option, and that means the decision is already made, which kind of puts an additional stress on data collection. If there's not enough there, or you can't use the data that's out there in a useful way, you can collect data, but empirical legal studies is a relatively new field, and the empirical methods are usually borrowed more from the social science than actually adapted to the requirements of legal questions. So it's a new field, and there's just a lot to be done still. And this is also where behavioral economics can come in, because with behavioral economics, we have a good toolbox of experimental research that we can use and in an adaptive form apply to empirical legal questions, and with that generate some insights, and generate those insights in areas that are otherwise hard to observe using the commonly used techniques such as surveys and things like that. And then the question is, what can that look like? And I'll walk you through one example of what we've done there. We were generally interested to see what is the role of publicly available information for the individual decision making about the available debt relief options. And I'll just very quickly explain the differences. There's much more than 3 options, but we focused on, I guess, more of the popular ones, which is bankruptcy. In the last financial year, that was about 60% of personal insolvencies. And bankruptcy is pretty much what you would think it is, with common knowledge. Debt agreements are also an act of bankruptcy, but they work more like a repayment agreement with your creditors, where over a negotiated time frame, you repay a certain amount, and they may also reduce, some interest on it, things like that. And then there's a non-insolvency option, which is financial hardship, which is, for example, if you can't pay things like power and other essential services, a lot of those services offer financial hardship schemes where you can apply and just negotiate with them and see if there's anything that can be done. And when most people make the decision about this, between those options, what they will do is look for advice and look for information. I've already mentioned. There's a few incentive problems in the system, because there's some advisors that in some instances can make money because their fees are tied to the repayments. And that only happens for the debt agreement option, but not for the other option. From the data collected from the regulator, as part of applying for one of those options, they ask you, in making your decision, what was the primary source of information that you've used? And for people who applied for a debt agreement, we can see that 93% said my primary source of information was a debt agreement administrator. For people who applied for bankruptcy, I've just listed a few options of where you can potentially get information from. There's a larger range. So we were interested in that to see what effect that has. And what we've done is we have designed a little survey experiment where, in collaboration with some of the legal scholars that we've been collaborating with, as well as some experts from legal clinics that deal with such cases on a day-to-day basis, we've created case studies that are representative of typical situations a debtor might find them in, and also cases where it's easily identifiable which option would be most suitable for the person in the case study. We've then provided participants with information from different sources of experts, and then asked them to make a recommendation about the person in the case study. What do you think they should choose? Overall, we found that the correct identification was under 50%, so on average people, even with provided information, really struggled to identify what would be best in which situation. And then the interesting part was that we kind of expected that. But what we didn't expect is that over all of the options that are listed in the graph, bankruptcy is under-recommended. So that should have been around even. We've given them an even number of cases. So what happened? That people do not recommend choosing bankruptcy even when that's the best solution to go for. Because of that, we've also asked those same participants about a couple of questions about their general knowledge about options, about the consequences they would expect, about preferences for choice, and a question about stigma. We found that for bankruptcy, People knew less, but they were more certain about what they knew. The consequences overall were perceived as worse for bankruptcy. There was a clear preference for people to choose the repayment plan over the bankruptcy. And when asked, would you think less of a friend or family member if they chose either option? They said, yeah, so when they're bankrupt, then I'd be more likely to think less of them. So all of these options kind of point towards pre-existing attitudes of stigma that might not be able to be outweighed by the information. So when it's not easy to identify what option you should choose, it looks like stigma plays an even larger role, even more emphasizing the need to understand those decisions and make sure that the regulatory framework can guide people to the best decision. And I'm over the time, but that's good, I was done anyway.